The Sunday morning service at Lakewood Church was reaching its crescendo. 16,000 voices filled the former Compaq Center arena, singing in unified worship as cameras swept across the sea of uplifted hands. Joel Osteen stood center stage, his signature smile radiating confidence as he prepared to deliver a message about embracing God's favor in your life. The energy was electric, the production flawless, the atmosphere carefully orchestrated for maximum impact. What no one in that massive auditorium knew was that in exactly 7 minutes, a woman sitting quietly in section 214 would be escorted out by security, and Joel Osteen's response would trigger a chain of events that would cost him donors, divide his leadership team, and leave his congregation speechless. Elizabeth Tabish sat in her seat, trying to remain inconspicuous. The actress who had brought Mary Magdalene to life for millions through The Chosen had almost decided not to come that morning. 3 days earlier, her podcast interview had gone viral in Christian circles, where she'd questioned whether megachurches were missing something essential about Jesus' message. She hadn't named Joel Osteen specifically, but everyone knew who she meant when she mentioned pastors living in mansions while preaching prosperity gospel. Now, sitting in his church, she felt exposed. She'd come out of genuine curiosity, wanting to challenge her own assumptions. But the moment a staff member recognized her face and connected it to that viral interview, everything changed. Security moved swiftly. 2 team members approached her during the worship song, leaning down to speak quietly. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." Elizabeth's face registered confusion, then hurt. She wasn't causing a disturbance, hadn't approached the stage, was simply sitting quietly. But protocol was clear. Anyone who had publicly criticized the church was considered a potential disruption risk. She stood slowly, gathering her things, preparing to leave without protest. There was dignity in her posture, a quiet grace that didn't match someone who needed to be removed. And from the stage, Joel Osteen saw it all. 20 years of preaching to massive crowds had taught Joel to read the room, to sense when something was off. He saw the security personnel, saw the woman's face, saw her standing to leave. He couldn't hear what was being said, but something about the moment struck him as profoundly wrong. His sermon notes lay before him, his perfectly rehearsed message ready to deliver, but suddenly the words felt hollow. He was watching someone being asked to leave his Father's house, and every instinct screamed that this wasn't what Jesus would do. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone had to choose between protocol and principle? When maintaining order collided with extending grace? When the comfortable path diverged sharply from the right path? What happened in that arena over the next 17 minutes would become the most viewed clip in Lakewood Church's history, generating over 40 million views and sparking conversations across the country. It would cost Joel Osteen the support of some of his biggest donors and the respect of some of his oldest friends. It would also challenge everyone watching to reconsider what it truly means to welcome the stranger, embrace the critic, and choose costly grace over comfortable image management. Joel made a decision that his PR team would later call reckless. He stopped mid-sentence in his sermon, held up his hand to pause the service, and spoke 4 words into his microphone that would change everything. "Wait, bring her back." 16,000 people fell silent. The security team froze. Elizabeth, halfway up the aisle toward the exit, stopped and turned back toward the stage. And in that moment of suspended animation, everyone sensed that something significant was happening, though no one yet understood what it would mean. What Joel did next would either be remembered as his finest moment of pastoral courage or his greatest mistake in 20 years of ministry. Elizabeth Tabish never intended to become the face of a movement questioning modern church culture. Her journey to playing Mary Magdalene in The Chosen had been unexpected, a last-minute audition that changed her life. Growing up in a small evangelical church in Texas, she'd experienced faith as something intimate and raw, worship services in modest buildings where everyone knew each other's struggles. When she moved to Los Angeles to pursue acting, she drifted from church, uncomfortable with both the entertainment industry's dismissal of faith and the celebrity-driven megachurches that dominated the Christian landscape. Playing Mary Magdalene had reconnected her to Jesus in a way she hadn't expected. Spending months studying the woman who had been delivered from darkness, who had followed Jesus with abandon, who had been the first witness to the resurrection, Elizabeth found herself asking hard questions. Would Mary Magdalene recognize modern American Christianity? Would she feel at home in arena-sized churches with multi-million-dollar budgets? The podcast interview that went viral hadn't been planned as an attack. She'd been asked about her faith journey, about what playing Mary Magdalene had taught her. She'd spoken honestly, perhaps too honestly. I wonder sometimes if we've traded the radical, uncomfortable message of Jesus for a more palatable version, she'd said. When I read the Gospels, I see Jesus eating with outcasts, touching lepers, challenging religious authorities who had made faith into a business. Then I see churches that look like entertainment venues, pastors who live in mansions, worship experiences designed to make people feel good rather than transformed. She'd been careful not to name anyone specifically, but social media had immediately connected her comments to Joel Osteen and Lakewood Church, the most visible example of everything she'd described. The backlash had been swift. Some praised her courage. Others accused her of judgmental cynicism. The clip had been viewed millions of times, dissected and debated across Christian social media. Joel Osteen's path to becoming America's most famous pastor had been equally unexpected. He'd never planned to lead Lakewood Church. That was supposed to be his father's legacy, John Osteen, a fiery Pentecostal preacher who had built the church from nothing. Joel had worked behind the scenes for 17 years, running television production, content to let his father be the face of ministry. When his father died suddenly in 1999, Joel had been thrust into leadership at 36 years old, uncertain and unprepared. His preaching style was different, more gentle and encouraging, less focused on sin and judgment, more emphasis on God's goodness and favor. Critics called it prosperity gospel light, theology that promised blessings without sacrifice. Supporters saw a man who gave people hope, who reminded them that God loved them, who made church accessible to those wounded by more traditional approaches. Under Joel's leadership, Lakewood had exploded. They'd moved into the former Compaq Center, transforming the 16,000-seat arena into a worship space. His books topped bestseller lists. His sermons emphasized positive thinking and God's favor. Joel was aware of the criticism. He'd heard it for 20 years. Most days he could dismiss it. But sometimes, in quiet moments, the questions nagged at him. Was he really preaching the gospel, or just motivational speaking with Bible verses? Elizabeth hadn't come to Lakewood to cause problems. She'd been invited by Sarah Mitchell, her former college roommate and longtime Lakewood member. Sarah had seen the viral interview and had gently challenged her. "You're criticizing something you've never actually experienced. Come to one service. See what really happens here." Elizabeth had resisted at first, but Sarah's challenge had struck a nerve. Was she being fair? Had her own disappointing church experiences made her cynical toward all large churches? She'd agreed to come, not to confront anyone, but to honestly observe and challenge her own biases. She dressed simply, arrived early, sat in an inconspicuous section, and genuinely tried to experience the service with an open heart. The morning had surprised her. The worship was polished, perhaps too polished, but she couldn't deny the genuine emotion she saw on faces around her. Joel's message seemed to genuinely encourage people who looked burdened. She'd found herself wrestling with her assumptions. Maybe there was room in God's kingdom for different expressions of faith. Maybe her criticism had been too harsh. Then security approached her, and in an instant, all her original concerns came rushing back. A staff member scrolling social media during worship had recognized her face, made the connection to the viral interview, and immediately alerted the security team. Marcus Chen, the head of security and former Houston police officer, reviewed the situation quickly. Protocol was clear. Anyone who had publicly criticized the church was considered a potential disruption risk. Better to quietly remove a potential problem than deal with a public incident. He dispatched 2 team members with clear instructions. Approach during the next worship song, speak quietly, escort her to a private room, explain that her presence made leadership uncomfortable given her recent comments. It was a script they'd followed dozens of times. What Marcus didn't anticipate was that Joel Osteen would see it happening and that his response would challenge everything the church thought it stood for. The arena fell into an eerie silence as Joel's words echoed through the sound system. Wait, bring her back. 16,000 people stopped moving, stopped whispering, stopped everything. The two security personnel escorting Elizabeth froze mid-step. Marcus Chen's voice crackled urgently through their earpieces. Stand by. Do not proceed. Pastor has intervened. Elizabeth stood in the aisle, heart pounding, completely confused. She'd been prepared to leave quietly. Now the senior pastor himself had just stopped his entire service. The cameras swiveled to capture her face, projecting her image on the massive screens. She felt exposed, vulnerable, with no idea what would happen next. Joel stepped away from the podium, his microphone still live, his expression serious in a way his congregation rarely saw. I need to address something that's happening right now. My security team is escorting someone out of our service, and I need to understand why before we continue. The directness was jarring. Joel Osteen didn't do confrontation. This unscripted moment felt dangerous, unpredictable. Marcus immediately activated his microphone to Joel's in-ear monitor. Pastor, she's been publicly critical of the church. We're following standard protocol for potential disruptions. Joel nodded slightly but kept his eyes fixed on Elizabeth. Has she disrupted our service in any way? The question was broadcast to the entire congregation. Marcus hesitated, aware that thousands were listening. No, sir, but given her recent statements about megachurches and prosperity ministry, we assessed her presence as a potential risk. His response was professional, by the book. But hearing it broadcast to everyone suddenly made the protocol sound different. Harsher. Less like wisdom and more like fear. Joel let the words hang in the air before responding. So we're removing someone from God's house not because of what they've done, but because of what they've said? Because they've criticized us. The question was gentle but devastating. This wasn't about safety or disruption. This was about image management, about protecting the institution from uncomfortable questions. Elizabeth felt tears prickling her eyes, not from embarrassment but from unexpected grace. She'd expected defensiveness, maybe a polished PR response. Instead, Joel was publicly questioning his own team's decision, choosing transparency over image control. Ma'am, Joel said, speaking directly to her, his voice carrying across the arena with surprising warmth. I don't know who you are or what you may have said about our church, but I'm asking you if you're willing to please stay. You're welcome here. The invitation was simple but profound. He was publicly welcoming someone who had criticized him, choosing grace over self-protection. The congregation erupted in spontaneous applause, though not everyone was clapping. Some sat in stunned silence. Others looked uncomfortable. Then Joel did something that shocked everyone. He gestured for Elizabeth to come forward, not just back to her seat, but toward the stage. Marcus's voice crackled urgently. Pastor, with respect, we should handle this offline. This is becoming a distraction. But Joel had crossed a threshold. Actually, Marcus, I think this is exactly what our service needs to be about today. We were about to hear a message about God's favor, but what kind of blessing is it if we're not willing to extend grace to those who question us? Elizabeth stood paralyzed, aware that every camera was on her, that this moment was being broadcast live. Part of her wanted to escape, but something in Joel's expression made her take a tentative step forward. Then another. She reached the stage stairs, and Joel descended to meet her halfway, extending his hand. I'm Joel. Thank you for staying. Elizabeth took his hand. I'm Elizabeth. I'm not here to cause trouble. Joel smiled genuinely. I know. And I'm sorry my team made you feel unwelcome. That's on me, not on them. His willingness to take responsibility struck her as genuinely humble. Joel turned back to face the congregation. Folks, I need to be honest. What kind of church are we? Are we a place where only supporters are welcome? Where criticism is treated as threats? Or are we secure enough in God's truth to welcome doubters, critics, and seekers? The question created visible discomfort. This woman apparently said some things about churches like ours that some people found offensive, Joel continued. And my team's response was to remove her. Not because she was disruptive, but because she'd been critical. When did we become so fragile that we can't handle criticism? Elizabeth felt compelled to speak. "Pastor Osteen, I should clarify something." Joel offered her the microphone. She took it with trembling hands. "I'm an actress. I play Mary Magdalene in The Chosen. A few weeks ago, I did a podcast interview where I talked about concerns I have about modern church culture. I wasn't specifically talking about your church, though I understand why people made that connection. I questioned whether churches that look like entertainment venues were missing something essential. And I was critical of prosperity gospel, of the idea that following Jesus is primarily about personal blessing rather than sacrificial love." The congregation stirred uncomfortably. She just criticized the core of Joel's message in front of his entire church. Then Joel did something no one expected. "Those are fair questions," he said quietly, and Elizabeth nearly dropped the microphone. "They're questions I ask myself sometimes, usually at 3 in the morning when I can't sleep." His vulnerability was stunning. This wasn't the polished Joel Osteen everyone knew. Marcus's voice crackled desperately. "Pastor, please. We need to control this situation." Joel reached up and removed his earpiece entirely, setting it on the podium. The gesture was symbolic. He was choosing this moment over careful image management. "Elizabeth, you said you play Mary Magdalene. What do you think she would say about this church if she walked in today?" The question was dangerous, inviting critique in front of his entire congregation. Elizabeth paused carefully. "I think Mary would look at this place and be amazed by the resources, by how many people you're able to touch. But I also think she'd ask what you're asking them to become. Mary wasn't just blessed by Jesus. She was transformed by him. Her encounter with Jesus cost her everything and gave her everything. And I wonder if our modern Christianity promises the giving without requiring the costing." Joel nodded slowly. "What surprised you most about her story when you were preparing to play her?" Elizabeth's expression softened. How much she risked to follow Jesus. She had everything to lose. Her reputation, her safety, her future. But she followed anyway because she'd encountered something real, something that transcended comfort or safety. That's what I worry we're losing. The willingness to be uncomfortable, to risk, to let following Jesus actually cost us something. The distinction resonated, and several people were visibly moved. Joel stood silently for a long moment, and the entire arena held its breath, waiting to see what he would do with this challenge delivered so publicly, so gracefully, and so devastatingly to everything his ministry had been built upon. Joel's silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. 16,000 people waited, cameras captured every expression, and Elizabeth wondered if she'd just destroyed any chance of bridge building. Then Joel did something that would be replayed millions of times. He laughed. Not dismissively, but genuinely, almost relieved. "You know what? You're absolutely right to ask that question." He turned to face his congregation, his posture shifting from defensive to open. "Can I be honest? I've spent 25 years trying to encourage people, trying to help them see God's goodness. And somewhere in there, I think I forgot Jesus didn't just encourage people. He transformed them. He challenged them." The congregation sat in stunned silence. This wasn't scripted vulnerability. This was raw and uncomfortable. "Elizabeth, would you sit with me and just talk? I think our congregation needs to hear more about what you've learned playing Mary Magdalene." 2 chairs were quickly brought onto the stage. They sat facing each other, and what followed was unlike anything Lakewood had experienced. "Tell me about the moment you realized this role was going to change you," Joel said, leaning forward with genuine interest. Elizabeth gathered her thoughts. It was during a scene where Mary encounters Jesus after he casts out her demons. On the last take, something shifted. I wasn't acting anymore. I realized that's what we're all searching for. To be fully known and fully loved. Not to be fixed, but to be transformed from the inside out. Joel nodded slowly. "That's beautiful. And it's convicting because I wonder how often the message people hear from this stage is about becoming more acceptable rather than being transformed." His admission sent ripples through the congregation. "When you preach about God's favor, what are you hoping people hear?" Elizabeth asked, her tone curious rather than accusatory. Joel paused. "I want people to know that God is for them, not against them. So many people grow up thinking God is angry, that they can never measure up. I wanted to create a space where people felt God's love. His explanation was sincere. But here's what I'm realizing. Hope without transformation is just wishful thinking. Maybe I've been so afraid of seeming judgmental that I've avoided the harder parts of the gospel. I don't think it has to be either or, Elizabeth offered gently. Mary Magdalene experienced both God's radical acceptance and his transforming power. Jesus didn't condemn her, but he also didn't leave her where she was. The question isn't whether we emphasize God's love or his call to transformation. It's whether we have the courage to hold both together. Joel sat back, processing. Can I ask you something? When you look at this church, does it look like what Jesus would build? The question was direct but asked with genuine curiosity. Joel looked around the arena. Honestly, I don't know. Jesus didn't have buildings or budgets. But I think the real question isn't about the size or production value. It's about what we're producing. Are we making disciples who look like Jesus, or consumers who like religious content? The distinction landed powerfully. When you played Mary Magdalene, Joel continued, what did Jesus ask of her? Elizabeth smiled. Everything. Her comfort, her security, her reputation. Following Jesus meant leaving behind everything familiar. But she did it because what he offered made everything else pale in comparison. That's the gospel. Not that God wants to make our current lives better, but that he wants to give us entirely new life. Joel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I think I've been so focused on helping people believe God wants to bless them that I've forgotten to tell them what that blessing actually looks like. It's not a bigger house. It's becoming more like Jesus, which means becoming someone who gives rather than grasps, who serves rather than demands. Elizabeth reached over and touched his arm gently. I think you just preached a better sermon than the one you had planned. The congregation erupted in applause. Not polite, programmed applause. This was cathartic, emotional, the sound of people witnessing something real break through something rehearsed. Joel wiped his eyes. Elizabeth, I'm grateful you came today. I'm grateful my security team tried to kick you out, because it forced me to confront something I've been avoiding. He turned to the congregation. How many of you came here hoping to hear that God wants to make your life easier? Hands went up across the arena. What if instead, God wants to make your life matter? What if the blessing isn't comfort but purpose? They stood, and spontaneously, without planning it, they embraced. The image became iconic, shared millions of times as evidence that authentic dialogue was still possible. The service ended 30 minutes past its usual time, but nobody seemed to care. As the final worship song played, the atmosphere felt electric, charged with something most congregants couldn't quite name. People weren't rushing to the exits as they typically did. They lingered, processing what they'd witnessed, many with tears still wet on their faces. Small groups formed in the aisles, discussing the unexpected exchange, wondering if this was a one-time moment or the beginning of something different at Lakewood. The production team frantically tried to assess what had just happened. Their carefully planned broadcast had been hijacked by an unscripted conversation that went against every messaging guideline. Some saw disaster. Others saw the most authentic moment Lakewood had produced in years. Elizabeth stood backstage, surrounded by a small crowd. Some congregation members approached with gratitude, thanking her for her courage, for asking questions they'd been afraid to voice. A woman in her 50s grasped Elizabeth's hands tightly. I've been coming here for 12 years, and I've always felt something was missing but couldn't name it. Today you named it. Others were less enthusiastic. A man in an expensive suit approached with barely concealed hostility. You had no right to ambush our pastor like that, to use his grace against him. Elizabeth tried to respond graciously, but he had already turned away. Sarah, her friend who had invited her, pushed through the crowd with tears streaming. I had no idea this would happen. I just wanted you to see we're not all what you assumed. Elizabeth hugged her. I know, and I'm sorry for my assumptions. Joel was having his own challenging conversations. His senior leadership team had gathered in a side room, and the tension was palpable. Marcus Chin stood with arms crossed, clearly feeling undermined. "Pastor, you made us look incompetent out there. We were following protocols you approved." Joel nodded wearily. "You're right. You were following my protocols, and those protocols were wrong. That's on me." David Harrison, the chief financial officer, chimed in with frustration. "3 of our largest donors have already called. They're threatening to pull their support. They didn't give millions to build a church that apologizes for teaching prosperity gospel." Victoria Osteen had been quiet, but now she spoke, her voice measured but firm. "Maybe that's exactly the problem. Maybe we've become more concerned about keeping donors happy than preaching truth." Her support surprised several people. What happened today was messy, but it was also the most like Jesus I've seen us be in a long time. Joel looked at his wife with gratitude. "I don't know if what I did was wise from a church management perspective, but I know it was right. And if we lose donors over it, then maybe we needed to lose them." The statement hung in the air, a line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Outside, social media was exploding. Video clips were being shared thousands of times per minute. Christian Twitter divided into camps. Some hailed Joel's response as humility and grace. Others accused him of capitulating to progressive critics, of abandoning sound doctrine. Secular media picked up the story quickly, fascinated by a mega-church pastor having genuine self-reflection on live television. The hashtag Joel and Elizabeth was trending within an hour. Elizabeth's phone flooded with notifications. Some The Chosen fans were thrilled. Others felt betrayed, accusing her of going soft, of being co-opted by the system she'd questioned. An hour after the service ended, Joel and Elizabeth met briefly in his office, away from cameras and crowds. The energy between them was different now, no longer adversarial but not quite comfortable. "I need to apologize," Joel said quietly. "Not for what I said out there, but for building a church culture that would have kicked you out in the first place." Elizabeth shook her head. "I need to apologize too. I made assumptions about you, about your motives. I was guilty of the same thing I accused you of." They sat in silence, both processing the weight of what had happened. "What do we do now?" Joel asked. "I just publicly questioned the entire theological foundation of my ministry. My board thinks I've lost my mind. Half my congregation is inspired and the other half is confused or angry." Elizabeth considered carefully. "I think you tell the truth. Not perfectly, because none of us have that. But honestly, you start asking the questions you've been avoiding and invite your congregation to ask them with you." Joel nodded slowly. "My father built this church on certainty. I don't know how to lead through questions." Elizabeth smiled slightly. "Maybe that's exactly what this generation needs. We've had enough leaders who pretend to have all the answers. What we're desperate for are leaders honest enough to admit they're still figuring it out." Before she left, Joel made an unexpected request. "Would you be willing to come back? Not for a public event, just to meet with our staff, help us think through what it looks like to hold grace and truth together." Elizabeth hesitated. "Joel, I'm an actress, not a theologian." But Joel pressed gently. "That's exactly why I'm asking. You're just someone wrestling honestly with faith. We need that perspective." Elizabeth agreed, though she sensed she was stepping into something much larger than a simple conversation. By evening, the story had been picked up by major news outlets. CNN ran a segment titled, "Mega Church Pastor's Surprising Response to Critic." Christianity Today published a rapid analysis. Conservative publications expressed concern Joel was abandoning biblical authority. Progressive voices celebrated what they saw as a mega-church pastor finally embracing humility. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone was taking sides. And in the middle of it all, Joel sat in his home that night, exhausted and uncertain, wondering if he'd just witnessed the beginning of something beautiful or the end of everything he'd built. His phone buzzed with a message from Elizabeth. "Thank you for choosing grace today. Whatever comes next, that moment mattered." Joel smiled despite his exhaustion and typed back, "Thank you for caring enough to ask hard questions. Let's figure out what comes next together." The week following the encounter became a defining moment in Lakewood's history. Joel faced a decision that would determine the church's future direction. He could treat Sunday's events as an anomaly, return to business as usual, and hope the controversy faded. Or he could lean into the discomfort and allow the questions raised to genuinely reshape how Lakewood operated. On Wednesday evening, he gathered his entire staff, over 200 people who kept the massive organization running. The tension was palpable. Some had been fielding angry calls all week. Others had received messages of gratitude. Joel stood before them without notes, without his usual polished presentation. "I need to tell you something I should have said years ago. I don't have all the answers. And I'm tired of pretending I do." The admission shocked the room into silence. What happened Sunday wasn't planned, and it wasn't comfortable. But it was necessary. "We've built something impressive here, but I think we've lost something essential along the way." His voice carried conviction. "We've become really good at making people feel good about God, but I'm not sure we've been as good at helping people become like Jesus. And those aren't the same thing." He announced changes that shocked many. "We're going to start a new teaching series called The Cost of Following Jesus. Not the benefits, the cost. We're going to talk about sacrifice, about what it means to take up your cross, about how following Jesus might actually make your life harder before it makes it better." Several staff members exchanged worried glances. This wasn't the Lakewood brand. "I know this is a risk. We might lose people. We've already lost some donors. But I'd rather have a smaller church that's actually following Jesus than a massive one that's just celebrating the idea of him." Joel kept his promise and invited Elizabeth back the following week for a private meeting with his leadership team. The session was tense at first. David Harrison questioned why they were taking counsel from someone who'd publicly criticized them. But Joel was firm. "Because she asked questions we should have been asking ourselves." Elizabeth came prepared but humble. "I want to be clear. I'm not here as an expert. I'm here as someone who's asked the same questions about my own life." She shared honestly about her struggles with Hollywood's version of success, about how playing Mary Magdalene had forced her to confront her own compromises. "The truth is, we all struggle with this. The temptation is always to water down the message so it goes down easier, to prioritize growth over depth, to measure success by visibility rather than faithfulness." The conversation that followed was raw and productive. Some leaders remained defensive, but others began asking genuine questions. How could they maintain accessibility without losing substance? How could they preach grace without cheapening it? Elizabeth offered perspective. "In The Chosen, we've tried to show Jesus as fully divine and fully human, as someone who was both radically accepting and radically transforming. That tension is uncomfortable, but it's where the gospel lives." Over the next several weeks, the changes at Lakewood became more visible. Joel's preaching shifted noticeably. He still emphasized God's goodness, but now balanced it with honest discussion of discipleship's cost. He preached a sermon on the rich young ruler that made several wealthy attendees visibly uncomfortable. He taught about Jesus' warnings that following him might divide families, cost friendships, require sacrifice. The response was mixed but telling. Some longtime members left, frustrated that their encouraging, positive church had become challenging. One family who'd attended for 15 years sent Joel a letter. "We come to church to be lifted up, not beaten down." Joel felt the loss deeply, but he also saw something else happening. New people started coming, often younger, often burned out from performative Christianity, drawn by the honesty they'd been craving. A college student approached Joel after a service with tears. "I stopped going to church 2 years ago because it all felt so fake. But what you're doing here feels real. It feels like Jesus." Comments like that sustained Joel through the criticism. Elizabeth and Joel maintained regular contact, meeting for coffee when schedules allowed. Their friendship raised eyebrows. Critics accused Joel of being unduly influenced by Hollywood. Both ignored the speculation, finding in each other someone who understood the unique pressure of public faith. 3 months after their initial encounter, Lakewood hosted its first open forum night, an event that would have been unthinkable before. Joel invited the congregation to bring their hardest questions about faith, about the church, about God. No topic was off-limits. Questions ranged from theological to personal. One woman asked about the prosperity gospel directly. "Pastor Joel, do you still believe God wants to prosper us financially?" Joel's answer was careful but honest. I believe God cares about every area of our lives, including our finances. But I think I've sometimes presented that in a way that made it sound like following Jesus is primarily about personal benefit. And that's not the gospel. The gospel is that Jesus is worth following even when it costs us everything. The answer didn't satisfy everyone, but it was genuine growth. By the 6-month mark, Lakewood's attendance had dropped by about 15%, a statistically significant decline that worried the board. But other metrics told a different story. Participation in small groups had increased by 40%. Volunteer rates for community service had doubled. Giving to missions and local outreach had increased even as overall budget decreased. People were engaging more deeply even as the crowd grew smaller. Joel reflected on these changes during a staff meeting. We're becoming a different kind of church. Smaller in some ways, but deeper. And I'm okay with that. Victoria added her observation. For years, people came here to feel better. Now they're coming to become better. That's a crucial difference. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect, but the conversation had changed. The questions were being asked. And both Joel and Elizabeth had discovered that sometimes the most transformative encounters are the ones we never planned. 1 year after that unexpected Sunday morning, Joel Osteen and Elizabeth Tabish sat together on a different stage at a faith and culture conference in Nashville. The contrast to their first encounter was striking. Then, they'd been adversaries thrust together by circumstance. Now, they were friends, collaborators in a conversation that had grown far beyond either of them. Joel opened with characteristic honesty. A year ago, if someone had told me that having a critic escorted out of my church would become the best thing that happened to my ministry, I would have thought they were crazy. But it's true. That moment forced me to confront questions I'd been avoiding for 20 years. Elizabeth smiled warmly. And if someone had told me that the mega-church pastor I'd been criticizing would become one of my closest friends, I would have been equally shocked. I learned that it's easy to criticize from a distance. It's much harder to engage with curiosity and humility. Joel taught me that grace is especially powerful when we extend it to those who challenge us. Joel shared openly about the cost. We lost about 20% of our congregation in the first year. Several major donors left. But we gained integrity. We gained depth. We gained people who were actually being transformed, not just entertained. He described how Lakewood had changed, how they now focused on spiritual formation over entertainment, how discipleship had become central. We're not perfect, but we're asking the right questions now. Elizabeth spoke about her transformation. I used to think my job was to call out everything wrong with the church. Now I realize my calling is to help build something better. Criticism without participation is just cynicism. The church, for all its flaws, is still Jesus's idea. A young pastor in the audience stood, voice shaking. I lead a church of 50 people. Your story gave me permission to focus on depth rather than size. Joel responded warmly. The church doesn't need more celebrities. It needs faithful shepherds who care more about transformation than attendance. Another person asked Elizabeth how she reconciled her criticism with her friendship with Joel. People are more complex than labels. When confronted with hard questions, Joel didn't get defensive. He got reflective. That's rare and precious. Videos of their dialogue were shared millions of times. 6 months later, Christianity Today documented the Osteen effect, showing how churches across America had been influenced by their encounter. Dozens of pastors shifted their teaching to include discipleship's cost. Several megachurches implemented open forum nights. Young adults who'd left the church were cautiously returning, drawn by leaders willing to admit uncertainty. Their friendship deepened into genuine mutual respect. They texted regularly, encouraged each other through challenges, and became iron sharpening iron. The story became more than a viral moment. It became a parable for a generation desperate for authentic faith, for leaders willing to admit uncertainty, for grace extended across divides. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone chose grace over self-protection? When a leader risked reputation for authentic connection? Joel Osteen and Elizabeth Tabish's encounter reminds us that transformation often begins when we're finally honest enough to admit we don't have all the answers. It shows us that the church is at its best not when it's defending itself, but when it's questioning itself. And it proves that sometimes the people we most need to hear from are the ones we're most tempted to silence. Their story is an invitation to approach our differences with curiosity rather than condemnation, to extend grace especially when it's costly, and to remember that following Jesus is less about having the right answers and more about asking the right questions with humble hearts. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe the church should be a place where honest conversations happen, where critics are welcomed rather than ejected, and where transformation matters more than reputation.